Yes, you will get better. And yes, there is life after benzodiazepine. Let's get that out of the way. I know that's the first question on your mind because it was the first question on my mind when I discovered that I had become dependent to my prescribed benzodiazepine. In fact, when I began to experience the withdrawal symptoms, I practically ran to my computer, desperate for answers, embarking on a long and exhausting Google expedition. You know the one. Usually begins with WebMD's, "You must be dying," and ends up with you watching testimonial videos of people going through benzo withdrawal hell. Of course, I was quickly overcome to dread once again I began hearing the testimonials from people being weaned off the medication and going through absolute torment. Their symptoms were unreal. Their stories were unreal. What makes this even scarier is that many psychiatrists and medical doctors are not familiar with prolapse withdrawal syndrome. With this condition, a person can experience pronounced benzo withdrawal symptoms for months or even years after taking their last dose. In many cases, physicians are simply unaware of how debilitating benzo withdrawal can be. They may even confuse your withdrawal symptoms with those of your pre-existing condition. Unfortunately, these physicians tell you that it's all in your head, that benzo cannot possibly be responsible for the bulk of your symptoms. To call it frustrating is an understatement, because you know there's more going on. Disclaimer, this is not an anti-benzo or anti-psychiatry book. The truth of the matter is that, despite the horrible predicament you may find yourself currently in, the medication does help many people, and does have a valuable place in mental health treatment. That being said, there is a phenomenon taking place regarding serious benzo dependency, with profound withdrawal complications that can last years after an individual has come off the drug. It is a phenomenon that is largely going unnoticed and unaddressed in the field of psychiatry as well as psychology. We know this about the drug, about most drugs. After enough exposure, our brains begin to change and we become dependent, experiencing some interesting side effects. Whatever reason we originally took the drug for, be it to alleviate, treat, or even achieve a high, will still be there after the drug. However, now its symptoms are typically more pronounced and distressed. For example, one of the most common symptoms of withdrawal from a pain pill, surprisingly, is pain. Similar is true with muscle relaxers, where the withdrawal consists of severe muscle tension and even spasms. Similar is true with alcohol, which makes one very social and frees inhibitions. However, its withdrawal creates intense social anxiety. Benzodiazepine is no different. You likely began taking the medication for some kind of anxiety management. Therefore, at least during your wean and shortly after, you're going to experience heightened symptoms of anxiety. Understand that. Be prepared for that. But also know this. Our brains are perhaps the most fantastic, complex organ of adaptation. Our brains are designed to adapt and to heal. We only need to guide it in the right direction. This book is a result of my experiences and my journey into this relatively unknown area of psychotropic-related mental illness. That is benzodiazepine withdrawal, and its ugly manifestations, prolapse withdrawal syndrome, and agoraphobia, among other disorders. We will talk more about those later. I have begun referring to this information that I have collected and am about to share with you here as the Powers Manual, which I hope will serve as a comprehensive foundation and framework for understanding benzo recovery. Previous literature on benzo recovery has largely focused on two things: the benzo basics and advice on weaning at home. This book differs from those in that it provides a larger rationale, as well as a guide for recovery, managing symptoms, and dealing with pre-existing anxiety. Furthermore, my guide encompasses life after benzo and how we can continue to manage our anxiety. With my personal experience and research, I have conceptualized a simple but effective mode of recovery that I am confident can be of great help for individuals going through the benzo wean hell. I wanted this manual to be short and concise, packed with critical elements for success, information that is not only verified through my own experiences and many others, but through an extensive amount of research. I also wanted the information to be laid out in a simple go-to format so you can jump right to a specific area of interest without digging through pages trying to find what you're after. I wrote this book in hopes that it would be valuable to someone at any stage of benzo recovery. Whether you're just considering life without the medication or your doctor has directed you to wean off your medication. Whether you're in the midst of withdrawal symptoms, as you've been tapering for some months, or you've already weaned fully off the benzo but you're still having withdrawal symptoms and pre-existing anxiety. This manual will encompass benzo history, dependence, withdrawal, and life after medication. Additionally, it shares cognitive behavioral therapeutic techniques that can help profoundly with symptoms and anxiety management. In the next chapter, I will share my story and outline how I was able to make a full recovery, significantly decreasing my anxiety permanently. I went from an agoraphobic who couldn't drive his car for a straight year to giving presentations in front of a panel full of clinical psychologists, and I didn't die. However, I imagine you might have some immediate questions where reading through an entire book may seem daunting. Therefore, I have decided to include a chapter dedicated to answering the most common questions related to benzo recovery and life after. You can find this section in Chapter 3. Chapter 2, My Story. I've heard so many stories since I began my journey away from benzos back in late 2010, and my story doesn't really stand out in the crowd. In fact, many elements may sound very similar to your own. For me, it began in 2006 when I was undergoing physical rehab for a neck injury that I had sustained in a car accident. As a result of this injury, I had severe pain and spasms in the sternocleidomastoid, a large V-shaped muscle in the front of your neck that is responsible for rotating your head from side to side. I tried several modalities, from massage therapy, hot packs, and electrostimulation to muscle relaxers and anti-inflammatory medicines. Nothing really seemed to work, and I was growing very concerned for my health, which created a great deal of anxiety. Finally, someone recommended I try Valium, a member of the benzodiazepine family. It had a significant effect. Not only did it do wonders for my muscle spasm, alleviating a great deal of pain and distress, but it also relaxed my mind. My worries and anxieties melted away. I thought I had found a wonder drug. However, not all that glitters is gold. After several months of rather low dosages, I decided I didn't need the Valium any longer, so I quit taking it, cold turkey. That was my first huge mistake. It was day 3 without any benzo that I had my first panic attack. I remember it clearly. I was sitting outside of my porch swing, talking with a friend and laughing at his joke, when all of a sudden I felt a strange jolt to my system, as if someone had flicked an anxiety switch on inside my brain, and my skin began burning as if it were on fire. I jumped to my feet and put my hands up, sort of bracing for anything, yet nothing, as I felt my consciousness shrink back into a tiny cold and dark space, shrouded in the irrational fear of impending doom. By that time, my friend had noticed and asked if I was okay, but I didn't understand what was happening to me, and I couldn't answer. I just knew that my heart was racing, pounding intensely as if I had just ran a marathon. I was filled with a paralyzing sense of intense impending doom. It was so overwhelming that I felt as though I might black out at any moment. It was terrifying, especially because I didn't know what was happening to me. Was it my heart? Was it a stroke? Was I having some kind of major neurological brain issue? Within several minutes, the symptoms began to fade, and I still had no idea what had come over me. I just knew that it left me feeling shaken. After speaking with my doctor, I was informed that I had experienced a panic attack and that I had an undiagnosed anxiety disorder. He explained that up until this point, up until I had quit taking the medicine cold turkey and without his medical advice, I had been getting anxiety relief from the benzo. Needless to say, I was instructed to continue taking the drug because I physically and mentally now needed it. This didn't sit well with me because I didn't really have an anxiety issue that I knew of prior to taking the medication. Moreover, I did not even begin taking the medication for anxiety in the first place, so how could this be? Be that as it may, I was indeed receiving physical and emotional relief from the drug, so I followed my doctor's orders and I kept taking it. A few years went by and the benzo worked great. However, I began to build tolerance, and the drug simply didn't seem to be working as well as it had in the past. I was instructed by my doctor to raise the dosage. What began as a 2 milligram treatment of Valium once a day had built up a tolerance to 10 milligrams of Valium 1 to 3 times a day. It was during the very beginning of my bachelor's program in college that I hit what I've come to refer to as the wall. In short, the wall was a period where I had upped my dosage over the years to the point that it was no longer safe or wise to increase the dosage any further. At this point, the drug essentially begins to lose its effect, because the brain has now become dependent and is requesting more of the drug to achieve the same desired effects. The wall is a period where symptoms of anxiety start emerging again, despite the benzo. At this point, the doctors are likely to switch benzos, or now that benzo prescription ethics have changed drastically, they may decide to switch you to an antidepressant. But I don't have depression, you might be saying. Antidepressants have been shown in clinical studies to be effective in treatment and management of anxiety symptoms. However, an antidepressant, like a benzo, does nothing to address lifestyle changes, behavioral changes, cognitions, and irrational thinking tied to symptoms that are likely to be the culprit of your anxiety in the first place. Antidepressants simply and effectively treat symptoms of anxiety. In this point in my story, I was giving Xanax for quote-unquote breakthrough anxiety. In other words, I would only use this medication when I felt intense anxiety coming on or a need to thwart off a panic attack. I was also given an antidepressant. I was prescribed this even after I had explained to my doctor how I felt strongly that the benzo was the culprit, creating profound withdrawal symptoms. I was informed that I was mistaking these symptoms of withdrawal with the symptoms of my pre-existing anxiety disorder. Now, all of this came at a critical point in my life. I had just begun working on my bachelor program in college, and I had already been working extensively to apply for med school. However, I also had a huge passion for psychology, and I wanted to provide therapy for others. This created a crisis of faith for me, the details of which I will not bore you with. However, it is worth noting because the lessons I learned in those biology courses would later assist in my recovery. I did eventually decide to follow my passion and pursue a career in clinical psychology. In short, I began to realize that the doctors were simply not aware of what was happening to people who were experiencing benzo withdrawal, particularly individuals that, after years of use, were experiencing rather traumatic and prolonged, debilitating withdrawal symptoms. I could see that the only method of treatment for this condition seemed to be either more benzos or the introduction of other medications, such as antidepressants. The more I researched and learned about benzo withdrawal, as well as treatment options today, the more I saw value in weaning off the drug and trying to conquer the anxiety on my own. I was determined to try, and if my plan didn't work, I would surrender to the idea of taking an antidepressant. I considered it an experiment to attempt tapering off the drug and implementing psychological, cognitive behavioral techniques to manage my symptoms of withdrawal, as well as the symptoms of my supposed pre-existing anxiety condition. My mind was made up. I was going to wean, but how? How much? How long would it take? What are the symptoms going to be like, and what should I expect? Would I be able to work? Would I be able to finish college? What about my social life, friends, family, and relationship? My head was spinning. I was anxious, but I felt backed into a corner. Simply put, my medical method of treatment was no longer working. Not only that, but the literature I was reading about benzos suggested that it was safe and even necessary to wean off the drug after several years of use. I suppose we can consider it a neurological cleansing, as prolonged use of benzo is associated with some serious health risk, most notably degradation of memory and cognitive skills. Of course, some people take benzos for decades and do just fine. That should be noted. Unfortunately, I wasn't one of those people. After I discovered the Ashton Manual, based on the work of Dr. Heather Ashton, a benzo withdrawal specialist, I felt much better about how I was going to handle my wean. Her manual answered a lot of my questions and was packed with a ton of excellent information and resources. I urge anyone reading this to please research Dr. Ashton's work as well, especially her benzo withdrawal manual, the Ashton Manual. However, as helpful as the Ashton Manual was, it still didn't give me all the answers I was after. It did little to help me in terms of understanding and managing my symptoms, nor did it provide me with any kind of direction in the ways I might facilitate my own recovery. Simply put, her manual is a conversion manual on dosages and weaning rates, though it also has a lot of other relevant information on benzodependence, withdrawal, and recovery. Although I will be including similar information in this book, that is not my primary focus. While figuring out and achieving a plan for weaning is a must, there are a number of other elements that are critical to our recovery as well. Getting back to my story, I finished my bachelor's program while I was weaning, a feat that I almost feel is deserving of an award. To call such an accomplishment challenging is a gross understatement. Paradoxically, it was perhaps the best thing I could have done to keep myself in the fire of my fears, so to speak. Every week I had to give a presentation or lecture in front of a group of my peers, and it was always like an out-of-body experience. I didn't realize it at the time, but what I was essentially doing was exposure therapy. The environment I was in was a positive one, and it had forced me to put myself in uncomfortable spaces that I otherwise would have avoided like the plague had I been given the choice. This became a powerful tool for healing, one that I will be dissecting more throughout this book. Within 2 years, I had weaned myself from 30 milligrams of Valium to nothing. It was slow, but it was gradual and steady, which gave me time to adapt. Did it take too long? Perhaps, but had I progressed faster, I think the symptoms and the entire experience may have been unbearable, and I would have given up on my mission. After I graduated with my bachelor's degree, I celebrated by weaning completely off benzo, and I enrolled in a master's program for clinical psychology. I was very optimistic at this point, but I was still dealing with prolapse benzo withdrawal symptoms, even months after my last dose. Additionally, I had become wise to the fact that I did indeed have a pre-existing anxiety condition, and perhaps some depression, as the two are very closely connected. This was around the time that I really began to discover various therapies that would aid in my continuous recovery, not only from benzo, but from the anxiety disorder that I had been left with. So began another experiment. Could the information and method that I was learning as a future clinical psychologist truly be effective for something like anxiety and benzo withdrawal? I became my own test subject and started implementing techniques from therapies that I had learned, such as exposure therapy and cognitive reframing. The outcome of this experiment would be monumental to me. Not only did it have an implication on my recovery, but truth be told, I was also nervous about where my opinions would lie afterward. If these therapeutic techniques did not work, would this cause me to look down upon psychology in a negative light and lose faith in all that I had learned? How would I go on to work in a field where I treat people using therapeutic techniques that had failed me? Needless to say, at this point in my training education, I wasn't completely sure that I trusted the true effectiveness of psychotherapy. And though I had a serious passion for psychology, I was a little skeptical on the treatment outcomes. During my wean, I used a number of things to help aid in my recovery, from physical exercise and meditation to direct desensitization to prolonged exposure of various anxiety-causing stimulus. We are going to cover all of these things in this book. My story had two pivotal sections, the wean process and time period, and then life after benzodiazepine. It was through my training in clinical psychology that I really began to hone in on the techniques that would transform my disposition with benzo, as well as whatever pre-existing anxiety and depression I had before taking the medication. The next 2 years after I took my last dose were critical to my full recovery. This was the period of time where I'd really begun harmonizing all the elements for healing that I needed. It was within these 2 years that I had recovered so much that the benzo withdrawal feelings became distant memories. However, I wasn't out of the woods just yet. I still had many issues that I needed to work on in my life. Lucky for me, I had a head start as I'd already begun working on some of those things during my initial wean. In a sense, I was preparing myself for life after benzo. I knew that this challenge would require my faith. I had to believe that I would make a full recovery, but I also didn't want to feel like I just stepped out of a time chamber and back into my life. Preparing for the transition during the transition was key. The next few years were about conquering my pre-existing anxiety and depression, as well as creating and fostering a new, healthier lifestyle that promoted positive psychology and mental health in general. There was also a period where I had to conquer the mental fear of life without a prescription, without any safety net. I'd been told by my psychiatrist that I needed benzos for anxiety management, and that I would always need them. And yet, here I am today, symptom-free, for the most part, and absolutely without medication. My benzodiazepine withdrawal seems like a distant memory. In truth, the memory almost feels like it happened to someone else. I haven't taken the medication in 5 years, and I deal with less anxiety symptoms now than I have in a long time. So I know firsthand that healing is real and that it happens. I'm not here to offer false hope. I'm not here to tell you that you should wean off your benzo, and I'm certainly not here to tell you to ignore the directions of your physicians. This manual is simply a guide and resource to developing and fostering a safe and healthy recovery from benzodiazepine, should you and your doctor decide that coming off the drug is the best course of action. In short, this manual is a compilation of everything that has helped me heal during my difficult time.